Listen closely, because there comes a moment in life when saying nothing becomes more powerful than saying everything. It happens when someone provokes you, misunderstands you, disrespects you, walks away, or says something designed to make you react. Your first instinct is to explain yourself, defend your character, prove they're wrong, send the message, give the perfect response. But what if that instinct is exactly what keeps you weak the moment you feel the need to respond to everything? You hand someone else a piece of control over your mind. They speak, and you react. They accuse, and you defend. They become cold, and you chase an explanation. They misunderstand you, and suddenly your peace depends on convincing them of the truth. The Stoics understood something most people learn only after years of unnecessary pain. Not every action deserves a reaction. Marcus Aurelius lived surrounded by criticism, political pressure, betrayal, and conflict. His strength didn't come from having the perfect answer for everyone. It came from knowing what deserved his attention and what didn't. That distinction can change your life. Because silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes silence is the moment you refuse to let another person's behavior dictate your emotional state. Think about the last time someone said something that bothered you. Maybe you spent the next hour replaying the conversation, imagining what you should have said. Maybe you wrote a response, deleted it, rewrote it, and waited for them to answer. And even after the conversation ended, it continued inside your mind. They stopped talking. But you didn't stop reacting. That is the hidden cost of emotional reactivity. They may have left the room, closed the phone, or moved on with their day while you continued fighting an argument that existed only inside your head. Epictetus taught a principle that strikes directly at this problem. We don't control what other people say or do. We control what we do with what happens. And your real power begins at the exact moment your emotions demand a reaction, and you choose not to give one. But silence goes much deeper than simply keeping your mouth closed. Anyone can stay quiet for a few seconds. The real question is, can you remain silent when your ego is screaming to be understood? Can you walk away without proving your worth? Can you let someone misunderstand you without desperately correcting them? And can you remain calm when silence means you may never receive the apology, explanation, or recognition you wanted? That is where silence stops being a tactic and becomes strength. Because once you understand this, you'll discover something most people never learn. The most powerful person in the room isn't always the one with the strongest argument. Sometimes, it's the person who no longer needs to argue at all. Here is what most people never realize about silence. When you stop filling every empty space with explanations, arguments, and emotional reactions, other people begin to reveal themselves. Words can hide a lot. Someone can sound confident while being insecure. They can appear reasonable while secretly trying to control the conversation. They can claim they want understanding when what they really want is a reaction from you. And as long as you keep responding, you give them more material to work with. But silence changes the entire dynamic. When you stop defending every accusation, the other person has to carry their own words. They cannot blame you and immediately receive an explanation. They cannot provoke you and instantly receive anger. They cannot create confusion and watch you scramble to fix it. The space you leave behind becomes a mirror. Seneca understood the danger of allowing every external event to pull us into emotional disorder. The Stoic does not rush to answer simply because someone demands an answer. He observes first. He creates distance between what happened and what he chooses to do about it. And that pause is powerful because people often reveal more when they aren't getting the response they expected. Think about someone who constantly tries to make you feel guilty. The moment you stop defending yourself, they may push harder. They may repeat the accusation or try a different emotional trigger. And suddenly you see something you couldn't see while you were busy defending yourself. The conversation was never really about understanding. It was about control. This is why silence can expose unhealthy patterns without you accusing anyone of anything. You simply stop participating in the pattern. The same thing happens in relationships. If someone becomes distant just to make you chase them, your silence gives you information. If they genuinely care, they may communicate. If they only wanted your attention, they may disappear when you stop providing it. That difference matters. But there is an even deeper lesson. Silence doesn't just reveal other people, it reveals you. When you stop talking, you're forced to sit with your own thoughts. You begin noticing how often you explain yourself because you fear rejection, how often you argue because your ego cannot tolerate being misunderstood, how often you speak not because your words are necessary, but because you're uncomfortable with silence. And that realization can be painful, because sometimes the person you need to understand most isn't the person standing across from you. It's yourself. The Stoic uses silence not to manipulate people, punish them, or appear powerful. He uses it to observe reality without immediately trying to control it. And once you learn to observe before reacting, you begin to notice something extraordinary. People often reveal who they are when you stop giving them the response they expected. But there is still one trap left. Because even after you learn to stay silent, you may still feel the need to explain yourself, and that need can become a weakness of its own. There is something strange that happens when you stop talking. People begin to show you things they could hide while you were still trying to explain yourself. When you keep responding, you give the other person information. They learn what makes you angry, what makes you insecure, what makes you defensive, and which words can pull you back into the conversation. You may think you're protecting yourself by answering every accusation. But sometimes you're simply teaching someone how to control your attention. Silence removes that advantage. Not because silence magically changes another person, but because it changes what you can see. Imagine someone deliberately misunderstanding you. Your natural reaction is to explain your intentions. So, you explain. They question you again. You explain more. They find another problem. You answer that too. Before you realize it, you're spending enormous energy trying to prove something to someone who may have already decided what they want to believe. This is where the Stoic mind becomes different. Epictetus emphasized that your responsibility is not to control another person's judgment. Their opinion belongs to them. Your character belongs to you. Once you understand that distinction, you stop treating every accusation like an emergency. You can hear criticism without immediately defending yourself. You can hear an insult without returning one. You can watch someone become angry without becoming angry with them. And something fascinating begins to happen. Without your emotional reaction, the situation has nowhere to hide. If someone genuinely wants to solve a problem, they'll eventually communicate clearly. If they only wanted a reaction, they'll become frustrated when you stop giving them one. If they wanted to make you feel guilty, they may increase the pressure. Their behavior becomes information, and information is far more valuable than assumptions. But this is where many people misunderstand Stoic silence. Silence should never be used as a childish punishment. Ignoring someone just to make them suffer is still emotional dependence. You're still watching them, waiting for their reaction, hoping they notice your silence. That is not freedom. Real Stoic silence is different. You're not silent because you want to control what happens next. You're silent because you no longer need to. You allow people to reveal themselves without interrupting the process. You observe their actions instead of getting hypnotized by their words. You stop chasing explanations and start paying attention to patterns. And eventually you discover one of the most uncomfortable truths about human behavior. Sometimes people reveal their intentions most clearly when you stop giving them the emotional response they expected. But now comes the harder challenge. What happens when they misunderstand you completely? What happens when you know you're right, but they still believe you're wrong? That is where silence becomes even more difficult. Because the next battle is no longer with them. It's with your own need to be understood. And that need to be understood is more powerful than most people realize. You can know your intentions were good. You can know the truth of what happened. You can know someone judged you unfairly, and still a part of you will want to explain everything until they finally say, "I understand." But what if they never do? This is where many people unknowingly surrender their peace. They turn their life into a courtroom where they are constantly presenting evidence, defending their character, correcting misunderstandings, and proving they're not the person someone believes them to be. The Stoics would have seen the trap immediately. Your character is built by what you repeatedly do, not by how successfully you convince someone to believe in it. Marcus Aurelius lived surrounded by people whose opinions he could never completely control. Some admired him, some criticized him, some misunderstood him. Yet his responsibility remained the same: live according to your principles. That is the difference between self-respect and validation. Validation says, "I need you to understand me before I can feel at peace." Self-respect says, "I know who I am, and I will let my actions speak." Think about how much energy disappears when you stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. You no longer write the long message. You no longer replay the conversation searching for the perfect sentence. You no longer prepare a defense for an accusation that was never made in good faith. You simply continue living. And this doesn't mean becoming careless about criticism. A Stoic isn't someone who believes he is always right. Quite the opposite. He is willing to examine himself honestly. If someone gives you useful criticism, listen. If you made a mistake, admit it. If you hurt someone, take responsibility. But there is a difference between accepting responsibility and begging someone to approve of your existence. One requires courage. The other requires dependence. This is why silence can become a form of self-respect. You stop using words to purchase acceptance. You stop explaining every decision to people who aren't responsible for your life. You stop trying to win every misunderstanding. And slowly, something changes inside you. You become comfortable with the possibility that someone may think you're wrong. You become comfortable with being disliked. You become comfortable walking away without delivering the final sentence. That is a dangerous level of freedom for someone who once depended on approval. Because once you no longer need to convince everyone of your worth, people lose one of the easiest ways to control you. They can misunderstand you. They can criticize you. They can even walk away, and you can still remain standing. But there is a deeper reason people struggle to stop explaining themselves. Sometimes they aren't trying to convince the other person at all. They're trying to convince themselves. And until you understand that, silence will always feel uncomfortable. That discomfort is exactly where many people lose their strength. The moment someone pulls away, becomes cold, gives you the silent treatment, or tries to provoke you, something inside you starts demanding an answer. You want to know what happened. You want to fix it. You want to make them understand. And without realizing it, you begin dancing to the rhythm of someone else's behavior. This is where silence becomes a shield against manipulation. Manipulation doesn't always look obvious. Sometimes it looks like guilt. Sometimes deliberate confusion. Sometimes affection being given and withdrawn just to keep you uncertain. And sometimes it's simply someone learning that whenever they create emotional pressure, you immediately respond. The pattern becomes simple. They provoke. You react. They pull away. You chase. They accuse, you defend. They create tension. You restore peace. And because you keep responding, the cycle continues. But the Stoic approach introduces a powerful interruption. Pause. Not to punish them, not to make them wonder where you are, not to manipulate them back. Simply pause. Ask yourself, is this actually my responsibility? Epictetus built much of his philosophy around separating what belongs to us from what doesn't. Another person's mood belongs to them. Their interpretation belongs to them. Their attempt to provoke you belongs to them. Your response belongs to you. That distinction gives you something most people never develop: emotional distance. Imagine someone sends you an angry message late at night. The old version of you responds immediately. You explain, they send another message, you answer again. Soon you're emotionally exhausted over a conversation that never needed to happen. The stronger version of you reads the message and waits. You breathe, you step away, you return when your mind is clear, and sometimes you realize there is nothing worth saying. That is not weakness. That is control. Because manipulation often depends on speed. It works best when you react before you think. It needs your anger, fear, guilt, or desperation to keep the cycle alive. Silence creates space between the trigger and the response. And inside that space, you get your freedom back. But be careful. Silence doesn't mean tolerating disrespect forever. It doesn't mean allowing someone to cross every boundary while you pretend to be peaceful. Sometimes the strongest response is a clear sentence followed by distance. The Stoic doesn't stay silent because he is afraid of confrontation. He stays silent when confrontation has no value. That is the difference between suppression and strength. Suppression says, I want to speak, but I'm afraid. Oh. Strength says, I could respond, but this doesn't deserve my energy. And once you understand that difference, people can no longer pull you into every emotional storm they create. But there is still one person whose behavior can control you more than anyone else. You. And the next battle is learning how to silence the storm inside your own mind. The hardest person to remain silent around isn't always the person in front of you. Sometimes it's the voice inside your own head. You can leave the argument, put your phone away, and walk into another room. But if your mind keeps replaying what happened, you haven't really escaped the conflict. You're still reacting. The conversation may be over, but inside your mind, you're still defending yourself, rewriting your answers, imagining what you should have said, and preparing for what might happen next. This is where Stoicism becomes much deeper than simply controlling your words. It teaches you to create distance between an event and your judgment of that event. Something happens. Then your mind gives it meaning. Someone ignores you and your mind says, they don't respect me. Someone criticizes you and your mind says, they're trying to destroy my reputation. Someone walks away and your mind says, I wasn't good enough. But the event and the story you attach to it are not the same thing. Epictetus understood this distinction. An event can happen outside your control, but the judgment you make about that event is where your power begins. And this is why emotional control doesn't mean becoming emotionless. You will still feel anger. You will still feel disappointment, jealousy, fear, sadness, and rejection. The difference is that you stop treating every emotion as an instruction. Anger says, answer immediately. You pause. Fear says, do something before they leave. You breathe. Ego says, prove them wrong. You remain still. That tiny pause may look insignificant from the outside, but internally, that is where strength is built. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly reminded himself to return to reason instead of allowing the behavior of others to disturb his character. That principle matters even more today because modern life gives your emotions endless opportunities to react. A message arrives, a comment appears, someone stops replying, and within seconds, your mind can create an entire story. If you believe every story your mind creates, you'll spend your life fighting battles that may not even exist. The Stoic learns to ask a better question. What do I actually know? Not what do I fear? Not what do I assume? Not what does my ego want to believe? What do I actually know? That question creates clarity, and clarity creates calm. Eventually you begin to understand that silence isn't only something you practice with your mouth, it's something you practice with your mind. You stop arguing with imaginary versions of people. You stop predicting conversations that haven't happened. You stop punishing yourself for situations you cannot change. And you discover a form of strength nobody can take from you. The ability to experience an emotion without becoming its prisoner. But emotional control alone isn't the final test. The real test comes when you have every reason to speak, every reason to defend yourself, and every opportunity to win the argument. And you realize that walking away is worth more than being right. And that is where most people misunderstand strength. They think strength means having the final word, winning the argument, proving the other person wrong, making sure everyone knows your side of the story. But sometimes the strongest thing you can do is leave the argument unfinished. Not because you lost, because you finally realized that winning the conversation would cost you more than walking away. Seneca understood that a peaceful mind is more valuable than the temporary satisfaction of defeating someone with words. There are arguments where nothing can be solved because the other person isn't searching for truth. They're searching for victory, control, or emotional release. And if you enter that battle, you may win the sentence and lose your peace. Think about how often arguments continue long after the original issue has disappeared. One person says something, the other responds. Then comes another response. Suddenly, neither person is discussing the original problem anymore. They're attacking character, bringing up old mistakes, defending their ego, and trying to make the other person feel smaller. At that point, silence isn't surrender. It's an exit. You don't need to prove you're smarter. You don't need to make them regret what they said. You don't need to deliver the perfect final sentence they'll remember forever. Sometimes you simply say what needs to be said, establish your boundary, and stop participating. That is discipline. Because walking away from an argument requires something far more difficult than speaking. It requires tolerating the feeling of being unfinished. Your ego wants closure immediately. It wants the other person to admit they were wrong. It wants an apology. It wants recognition. It wants the final word. But life doesn't always give you those things. Some people will never apologize. Some will never understand your side. Some will tell the story differently. Some will believe they were right until the end. And if your peace depends on changing their mind, you've placed your peace somewhere you don't control. The Stoic accepts a painful truth. You can do everything right and still be misunderstood. You can communicate clearly and still be rejected. You can act with integrity and still be criticized. Your responsibility isn't to control the outcome. Your responsibility is to control the quality of your response. This doesn't mean becoming passive. If something requires action, take action. If a boundary must be spoken, speak it. If an injustice must be addressed, address it. But once your duty is fulfilled, let the outcome go. That is where silence becomes powerful. Not silence used as punishment. Not silence used to make someone chase you. Silence used because your inner peace is no longer available for negotiation. And once you experience that kind of silence, something inside you changes. You stop asking, "How can I make them understand?" You start asking, "What allows me to remain true to myself?" But that question leads somewhere even deeper. Because sometimes the hardest person to stop speaking to is someone who is no longer in your life. And that is the silence nobody teaches you how to practice. Sometimes the hardest silence isn't the silence between you and another person. It's the silence that begins after you finally accept that someone may never come back. This is where silence stops being a strategy and becomes detachment. Because when someone leaves, the mind wants to keep the connection alive. You check your phone, you replay old conversations, you wonder what they're thinking. You imagine what would happen if they suddenly returned, and even when you're no longer speaking to them, you may still be emotionally talking to them every day. That is not silence. That is attachment disguised as silence. The Stoics understood that freedom begins when you stop demanding that reality give you what you want. Epictetus taught the importance of recognizing what belongs to us and what doesn't. You can control how you love someone. You can control how honestly you treat them. You can control whether you act with dignity. But you cannot control whether they stay. You cannot control whether they understand your value. You cannot control whether they regret losing you. And you certainly cannot control whether they return. This is painful because the human mind hates unfinished stories. It wants an explanation, it wants closure. It wants to believe that if you wait long enough, behave perfectly enough, or become successful enough, they'll eventually realize what they lost. But that keeps your life suspended in the past. You may stop messaging them while secretly imagining the message you wish they would send. You may say you don't care while checking whether they viewed your story. You may tell yourself you're moving on while secretly hoping they notice. The Stoic asks a harder question. What if I never get the ending I wanted? Not to make you hopeless, to make you free. Because the moment you accept that some doors may remain closed, you stop standing in front of them, waiting for permission to live. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly reflected on the temporary nature of relationships, circumstances, and life itself. Nothing external is guaranteed to remain. The wise person doesn't love less because of this truth. He appreciates what is present without demanding that it last forever. That is real detachment. You can care without clinging. You can love without chasing. You can remember without returning. And you can let someone go without turning their absence into a judgment about your worth. Sometimes silence means you stop sending the message. Sometimes it means you stop checking. Sometimes it means you stop imagining the reunion. And sometimes it means you finally stop having conversations with someone who is no longer there. That is when silence becomes freedom. You're no longer waiting for their return to begin your life again. You're living now. And once you reach that point, one final attachment remains. The need to be understood, remembered, and validated by everyone around you. And that may be the final thing you must learn to release. And perhaps that is the deepest form of silence of all. No longer needing everyone to understand you. At some point you realize that constantly explaining yourself is exhausting because there will always be someone who sees you through their own assumptions. You can be honest and still be doubted. You can be kind and still be judged. You can give your best and still be misunderstood. And if you build your peace around being correctly understood by everyone, you'll spend your entire life trying to control something that was never yours to control. The Stoics offered a different path. Live according to your principles, then let other people's opinions remain where they belong, with them. Marcus Aurelius faced criticism, betrayal, political pressure, and people who didn't always understand his intentions. Yet the goal was never to become universally admired. The goal was to remain worthy of his own conscience. That changes the questions you ask. Instead of asking, "What do they think of me?" you ask, "Am I living in a way I respect?" Instead of asking, "Did they understand why I did it?" you ask, "Did I do what I believed was right?" Instead of asking, "Will they regret losing me?" you ask, "Am I becoming someone I am proud to become?" That is the transformation. You stop performing your life for other people's approval. You stop explaining every decision. You stop chasing people who have chosen distance. You stop responding to every insult. You stop turning every disagreement into a battle for your identity. And slowly, silence stops feeling like something you have to force. It becomes natural. You no longer need to announce your growth. You simply grow. You no longer need to tell people you're strong. Your discipline begins to show it. You no longer need to prove that you've moved on. Your peace becomes the evidence. This is what Stoic strength really looks like. Not becoming cold, not becoming emotionless, not pretending that nothing hurts. It means feeling everything without allowing every feeling to control your actions. It means knowing when to speak and when silence carries more wisdom. It means accepting that some people will misunderstand you, some will leave, some will criticize you, and some will never recognize the person you're becoming. And you can still move forward. Because your life was never supposed to be a courtroom where everyone gets to judge your worth. Your life is yours to live. So the next time someone provokes you, remember this. You don't have to answer every accusation. You don't have to correct every misunderstanding. You don't have to win every argument. Sometimes the most powerful response is the one you never give. Stay silent when silence protects your peace. Speak when your principles require it. Walk away when the conversation has become poison. And let your actions become louder than anything you could ever explain. Because when you finally stop needing to be understood, something extraordinary happens. You become free. And perhaps that is the greatest power of silence. Not that it makes other people respect you, but that it teaches you to stop depending on their respect in the first place. If this message gave you something to think about, leave one word in the comments. Silence. And if you learned something from this video, subscribe for more Stoic wisdom on building a stronger mind, greater self-control, and a life that doesn't depend on anyone else's approval. Remember it the next time your emotions demand a reaction. Sometimes strength isn't found in what you say. Sometimes strength begins with what you choose not to say.